All right, let's talk about nervous tissue. So, this nervous tissue, primarily made up of two different cells, the neurons, the primary functional cell, and you can see the neurons kind of right in the middle of the screen here. Let's see if we can identify one right here. This is a neuron, primary functional unit of the cell. It's got one long axon. We'll talk about its structure here in a bit, but we can see this axon that comes down long from it. And that's a neuron. And there's the other components of the nervous tissue, and that's the neuroglia. These are supporting cells. These are supporting cells of the nervous system. They include, particularly in the central nervous system, the microglial cells, the astrocytes, epidermal cells here, and even some ogliodendrocytes providing the myelin sheath structures. So these are the glial cells, often referred to as glial cells or supporting cells of the nervous system here. The neuron is, in fact, the functional components of the nervous tissue. And so neurons exhibit several unique characteristics, one of them being that they're excitable, right? We talked about that when we looked at the muscle tissue. These neurons possess polarized membranes, which allow them to conduct messages in the form of a nerve impulse from one part of the body to another. So excitability may often be referred to as irritability, the ability to respond to a stimulus, send information, propagate information across its cell membrane. Neurons are often have quite a bit of longevity, meaning that neurons can function for up to 100 years, right? They're supposed to be last our lifetime. The neurons you're born with are essentially the same ones you're going to die with. You don't grow new neurons, and we can see that at the bottom of the screen, amitotic, right? Particularly central nervous system neurons don't have the ability to divide. But we can talk about their high metabolic rate, so neurons cannot survive for more than a few minutes without oxygen, glucose, or ATP. Therefore, they possess a large number of mitochondria and a tremendous amount of vascularity. These neurons can actually be fairly large and long. They're among some of the largest cells in our body, often going the length of our limbs. And as we mentioned here at the bottom, amitotic, right? They lose their ability to divide after they assume the role as communication, right? Peripheral nerves may regenerate, but you're not going to grow new nerves. Now, as we've mentioned, the neuron is the more functional component of the nervous tissue. There's a couple of parts of the neuron that we should be familiar with. The first is its cell body, often referred to as the soma. This contains the nucleus and all of the cell's organelles. These a little kind of fuzzy hair structures protruding from the cell body are the dendrites. So we have dendrites protruding all the way around the cell body. And then traditionally, a neuron has one and only one axon. So we can see the axon here. This is the process that extends from the cell body, and information travels down the axon towards the synapse or the axon terminal. Now, again, the cell body, often called the soma, is the enlarged metabolic region of the cell where the nucleus is located. A cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system is going to be referred to as the nuclei. Remember that? The clusters of cell bodies within the peripheral nervous system will be referred to as the ganglion. Oh, let me stick out here. In the peripheral nervous system will be called the ganglia. Neurons possess large numbers of rough endoplasmic reticulum clustered within the cell body to form Nissl bodies. And then there's the processes. Remember, these processes are projections that go out in each direction. The dendrites are a neuron process which possesses large surface area because of its numerous branches, also known as dendritic spines. The dendrites receive chemical signals as well as conduct electrical signals towards the cell body. These electrical signals are not nerve impulses. They're called graded potentials. And then there's the axon, right? The axons are capable of generating action potentials and transmitting nerve impulses away from the cell body during the exoplasmic transport. Whenever this signal travels from the axon terminal back towards the cell body, it's called retrograde flow. The plasma membrane surrounding the axon is the axolemma, where the cytoplasm is called the axoplasm. The axon forms at the axon hillock. This is like a trigger zone. We can identify this here. Let's kind of zoom in here. So there's an axon hillock, right? If you can even follow that outline there. And this is like the trigger zone. This is where the graded potentials must reach this area before the neuron can be converted into an action potential, right? So for that information, but the axon hillock right there. And so as the axon approaches the next cell, there's many fine extensions that branch from its forming telodendria, and each of them ending in the axon terminal, often known as the synaptic terminal. So after we get to the end here, we get to the synapse, and we'll see a fine branching of what we'll refer to as the telodendria. These kind of dendritic spines located right at the end of the And so now that we've started to identify the different parts of a neuron, right? The cell body, which contains the metabolic activity, the nucleus, and all of the organelles, and then the axon, which is the fibers that send the information. We can start to identify some of this gray and white matter as well, right? So the gray matter is actually the regions that contain a number of cell bodies, right? It's a collection of cell bodies and their associated dendrites. So it's a grouping of cell bodies. Is where a lot of information is being sent to. The white matter will be identified as the axons. It's a region of axons, and this white matter is often given its name because of the insulated lipid-rich substance called myelin. So the distinction between this gray matter and white matter often applied to the central nervous system, where these large regions can be seen with the unaided eye. Right? So these two regions within the nervous system structures, again, referred to as the gray matter, or the regions that have many cell bodies and dendrites, or in the white matter, the regions where there's a number of axons. Let's take a look here a little bit closer even. Right? If we take a look here at the screen, we can see this brain here, and you can even see there's a distinguishing line. We'll make it a little growing here. We can see that there's a line, right? The gray matter, that's where we're going to have a collection of cell bodies, the dendrites together, so information is going to be sent to those regions, maybe even sent out from those regions. And then the white matter, this is where it's the fibers, the cables that are going to send information. And then the synapse of the neuron, right? Neurons don't actually touch. There's a minute space. There's a junction between them. That's called the synapse. And what happens is that there's neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters will diffuse across the synaptic cleft, right? The synaptic cleft, we can see that space right there. And so the neuron that is sending the information will be referred to as the presynaptic neuron here. So information will travel down the presynaptic neuron where we get to the axon terminal. Here we have the axon terminal. In the axon terminal, we can see that there's a number of synaptic vesicles containing neurotransmitters that information will be sent, the action potential will be sent down the axon terminal, causing the neurotransmitters to be released via exocytosis from the presynaptic neuron onto the receptors located on the postsynaptic neuron. So here we have the presynaptic neuron, which is the information being sent from, and then landing on the postsynaptic neuron. When we classify the types of neurons, we can classify them on their structure. So when we classify them by their structure, we often refer to their processes. So the first one we have here, this is a bipolar neuron. It has two cell processes, one dendrite and one axon. So a cell will always have at least one axon, and then it can have multiple dendrites. However, in a bipolar neuron, there's one dendrite, one axon. Bipolar neurons are rare but occur in the retina, the eye, as well as in the nasal mucosa, so for the smell sense. In a unipolar neuron, the dendrites and axon are actually continuous and basically fuse with the cell body located off to the side. Many sensory neurons of the peripheral nervous system are actually unipolar, just like we see here. So what you have is one single process, which then will split into both ends. So you can have a dendritic. We'll call this the dendritic. And the axonal. So yeah, we have the single projection, one single process coming from the cell body, and that extends in both directions. You have a dendritic end and an axonal end as a result. And then finally, there's what's known as the multipolar, right? Multipolar neurons, they have one axon, as most cells do. They have one axon and multiple dendrites, right? So you see the dendrites here. Let's move it. So you have the dendrites and one single axon. So you have the dendritic end right here with a number of different dendrites extending from the cell body and one single axon. This is a multipolar neuron. We can also classify these neurons based on their function, right? Their function. So they can be sensory neurons, right? So different neurons that transmit the impulses from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system. Those are sensory or afferent neurons. These are often unipolar neurons to the skin or internal organs. The bipolar neurons are the ones that we mentioned. Remember the sense of smell, olfaction, as well as the sense of vision in the retina of the eye. Motor neurons, remember motor referring to the efferent. Motor neurons transmit impulses away from the central nervous system to the effectors or the organs or glands. These are almost always multipolar. And multipolar neurons have the cell body located within the central nervous system and the axons forming the neuromuscular junction on the effector cells, right? Like the motor or muscles. And then the most abundant, right, are actually the interneurons. The interneurons are often referred to as association neurons. These are found in the central nervous system, in the brain and spinal cord, and they're primarily multipolar, right? They take information from a number of different cells, presynaptic nerves. Now, let's take a look here. So we can see we have the sensory or the afferent neuron sending information to the central nervous system. So that's the green one here. You can see that it's a unipolar, right? Let's jump in there. We can see that this is a unipolar with one process extending. So this sensory receptor from the skin to the spinal cord is a unipolar neuron. We have a interneuron here. This interneuron is going to connect between the afferent information or the sensory information, the afferent information here. And that's going to connect the afferent information with the efferent response, right? The response to the motor output, which the information is going to leave out of the spinal cord here. This is the efferent information. And for simplicity, these look very like unipolar, but however, they're very often multipolar cells that we're looking at, the effector as well as the interneurons, primarily multipolar cells. And then finally, the supporting cells of the nervous system, referred to as the glial cells. There's separate cells in the central nervous system and in the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, you'll find 4 different types of glial cells. The astrocytes, one of the more numerous of the glial cells in the central nervous system, responsible for supporting the cells of the neurons. They maintain a concentration of chemicals in the extracellular space. They also help to maintain the blood-brain barrier. The name astrocytes gets their name from their star-like appearance. Another cell is the microglia. The microglia is responsible for immunity or breaking down potentially harmful cells. They're phagocytic that dispose of debris, dead brain cells, bacteria. The oligodendrocytes are the myelinating glial cells, so they provide the myelin sheath structures to cells in the central nervous system. And the epidermal cells, they're ciliated cells that line the cavities of the brain and spinal cord. They help to maintain cerebrospinal fluid. In the peripheral nervous system, the glial cells include the satellite cells. These are protective cushioning cells in the peripheral nervous system that surround the cell body. And Schwann cells. Schwann cells form the myelin sheaths in the peripheral nervous system. So here's another diagram of it. You can see the satellite cells located all around the cell body here. There's the satellite cells there. And then located on the axon, you can see that there's the Schwann cells providing myelination to them. It's going to allow the information to send that much faster. And so, what is the myelin sheath? Well, some neurons have this covering that's composed of a whitish fatty material called myelin. What it does is it actually insulates the fibers and increases the rate of transmission. So myelin acts as an electrical insulator, which actually greatly increases the speed of the nerve signal. Unmyelinated axons conduct velocities at a range of about 1 to 10 meters per second, whereas myelinated axons can conduct impulses almost 15 times as fast, up to 150 meters per second. And so again, it's the oligodendrocytes that create the myelin sheath in the central nervous system. The Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system, which envelop and rotate around the nerve fibers, help to myelinate the axons of the peripheral nervous system. We'll talk about this and how it improves the action potential, the speed of an action potential, when we talk about action potentials in the next section. But until then, stay safe and take care. I look forward to seeing you.